Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Natalie and I'm the school's liaison officer at Magdalene College in Cambridge, and I'm joined by Josephine, so I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Josephine. I'm the Access and Outreach Coordinator at St Peter's College in Oxford.
Thank you. So we're going to run through a few bits of advice and information about online interviews. So hopefully you've all submitted your applications to either Oxford or Cambridge and are waiting to hear if you're invited to interview. So best of luck to you all, of course, goes without saying. So today's session is hopefully a bit of an introduction to what the interview process is like and what you can expect from it. And we'll also have some student ambassadors with us who I will introduce slightly later on, and they are here to answer all your questions, and bearing in mind that they are successful interviewees from the last few years, so they are very well placed to answer any questions that you've got about the interview process. So to start with, we're going to go through a bit of information to get going, and then if you have any questions later on, please pop them in the chat, but hopefully we'll answer quite a few questions in this initial section. So just to start with, why do Oxford and Cambridge interview? You probably know that most universities that you may have applied for don't have interviews, and they have a slightly different application process with a few less hoops to jump through and a few less stages. So why do Oxford and Cambridge do interviews? The first reason, as you may be aware, is that Oxford and Cambridge receive lots and lots of really high quality applications each year. The vast majority of the applications we receive are students who are good enough for Oxford and Cambridge. They're good enough for a place. So it's really, really tricky to decide between them. So what we like to do and have done for many, many years is to give applicants as many chances as possible to show us why they're the right student for the course, and to show off to us and tell us why they're the best candidate and we should choose them over everyone else. So we have lots of different opportunities to get to know the candidates a bit better before making an assessment on their applications. This includes things like admissions assessments that you may have already sat or be preparing for. It includes the extra questionnaires we might send you, especially for Cambridge, and it includes the interviews. So focusing on the interviews, firstly, interviews really allow us to assess, firstly, how you think and respond to being challenged. And we're going to talk through a few kind of sample questions and some ideas of what you might be asked on to help you understand this concept a bit better in a second. We also want to establish if you would enjoy and benefit from the teaching style of the university. Oxford and Cambridge are a little bit different to other universities in that they teach on partly quite a small group basis, either tutorials in Oxford or supervisions in Cambridge, which are the same thing under different names. And this is quite a different teaching style, but it's one that you can really enjoy and get a lot out of if you're the right candidate for that course and you benefit from that particular teaching style. And then thirdly, whether your interests and aptitudes align with your chosen course. So whether we think from your application that you've chosen right, essentially, and that you're the best fit for the course you've applied for. So interviews help us to get to know you a bit better and find out a few of these things. So I'll hand over to Josephine to talk about the specifics of being invited to interview.
Thanks, Natalie. So who gets invited to interview? In terms of the statistics, it differs ever so slightly, but typically Oxford and Cambridge together receive about over 20,000 applications each year for around 3,000 places. In Oxford, the tutors shortlist approximately about 10,000 of those candidates who they feel that they've got the strongest potential. And in terms of what they look for in their applicants is they're looking at whether or not they meet the entry requirements for the different subjects that they've applied to. And they also take into consideration sort of individual contextual data for different applicants. In Cambridge, it's about 75 to 80% of candidates that are invited to interview, and around 17,000 of those applicants. So in terms of when you might find out about your interview, you will receive a letter or an email that will indicate whether or not you have been invited to an interview. Usually you'll find out between sort of the middle of November and early December. And that will depend on whether or not you've applied to Oxford or Cambridge. There's no kind of set date necessarily that you will absolutely hear. But all interviewees and interviews, so all interviews are expected to take place between the 4th and the 15th of December. So there's quite a quick turnaround after that you hear whether or not you've been invited to interview to when your interview is. Your invitation letter or email will usually come directly from the college, so you'll usually get contact from the admissions officer or person who looks after admissions in your college that you applied to, or the college that you were assigned to if you did submit an open application. And in terms of the form that interviews will take place, so if we're thinking about online interviews, this is something that Oxford have moved towards. So all of our interviews are now online. And these are just sort of some things to think about when completing your online interviews. So you would want to consider choosing a place that you'll be able to kind of perform best. So really kind of think about where your environment is. So have you got a room that you can go to that you can then complete your interview in, that you won't be disturbed in? And if that's not necessarily at home, talk to your school directly, who can also help to then sort of rearrange a space for you. And you also want to ensure that you've got reliable access to the internet and to make sure that your connection is strong, so that that's not something you have to worry about in advance of your interview. And at Cambridge, it's so some colleges offer then tech checks as well before the interview, just to sort of ensure that everything is working as well.
You might be aware that most colleges in Cambridge are joining Oxford in the online interviews format. There are, however, 6 colleges who are doing in-person interviews. So for any of you who've applied to any of these colleges, just a quick word on what that entails and sort of the differences here. So the colleges who are doing in-person interviews for UK applicants this year are Gonville Keys, King's, Pembroke, Peterhouse, Selwyn and Trinity. So the first thing I'd recommend doing is checking if the college will reimburse your travel costs to and from Cambridge. This is usually the case if you are eligible for free school meals or pupil premium, or you have recently or currently been in care. But there may be other criteria as well. So just have a look and see if you're eligible for that and contact the college if you're not sure. But bear in mind, crucially, that the type of questions that you'll be asked and the level of assessment that's done in the interview is exactly the same, no matter whether you're interviewed in person or online. You're probably quite used to doing online sessions and lessons and things by this point. And so you'll know that there's not much difference of how people kind of act and respond to questions either in person or online, and applicants are treated exactly the same regardless of whether they are doing an in-person or an online interview. So hopefully that's a bit reassuring.
Okay, so you might also then be thinking about who is going to be interviewing me, or who will be sort of online in the room with you or in person. So usually you'll be interviewed by a couple of academic tutors. They will be attached to the college that you are being interviewed at, and they will be experts in their subject, so the subject that you've applied for, so that you'll have contact with people that you could then also be studying with. So they teach and research at the university, and you will have direct contact with people who will then decide whether or not your application will progress after interview. So yeah, normally be about 2 tutors. Sometimes in the case of online interviews, you might have somebody else in the room online that is perhaps observing, but they will introduce themselves. So, you know, you will always be introduced to whoever is there in person or virtually. And at Cambridge, again, it will usually be the case that you'll have 2 interviews and each with 2 academics. At Oxford, similarly, you will have potentially a couple of interviews, but again, that depends on the subject, and you'll get direct confirmation on how many interviews you'll expect to have. So some of the questions that you might be asked at interview. First of all, I think it's really important to remember that the tutors are not there to catch you out. And actually what they want to do is just to really put you at ease in the moment. So they might ask you a couple of introductory questions that will sort of allow you to relax in the environment, and those might refer back to things that you submitted in your application. So it might be something they've read on your personal statement, or they might ask you why you applied for a particular course. After that, after you've kind of settled in, then they'll ask you slightly more subject-specific questions. And that again depends on sort of what is relevant to your course. Pre-interview, so it might be the case that before you actually have the interview, you will be given something to look over in advance. So that'll be, say for example, you have applied and are interviewing for a humanities subject, you might have a written source that you'll be given time to read through, and then there will be some questions that will be based on that. Alternatively, if you've applied to maths or perhaps a science, you might also then be given something to look at, like a problem to work out. And again, that's not to catch you out, it's just to give you something almost like a stimulus to then build questions from, and something that you can then work with in the interview. Equally, the tutors will also refer to any written work that you've submitted, and that might again be a focus for the questions that they ask you. Equally, questions will also focus on testing the skills that they're looking for, in terms of what they would want for someone studying their course. So again, they're not questions to catch you out, but they're questions to actually showcase your thinking and your ability to analyze in the moment, and essentially show your thought process as you kind of work through your answers. And there's also something that you can go to on Oxford's website, where they've published some sample interview questions. We can pop a link in the chat a bit later, and that will give you some idea of sort of what to expect. And again, these are directly applicable to Cambridge as well, so very, very similar questions. Okay, what do you do if you don't know the answer? So I think we've all been in positions where perhaps you need a little bit more time to think about your answer, or you genuinely are not sure. I think the main thing is just to think about, firstly, try not to panic, and that there is more than one way to approach an answer to a question. What the tutors are interested in is not necessarily your ability to kind of list facts or sort of remember key information. It's actually to show how you approach a difficult question. So many of these questions are designed to test your ability to apply logic and reason, and it might be something that you haven't encountered before. But again, it's how you sort of process your working through that question that's important. You might also want to explain that you haven't covered that topic yet. So it's okay to sort of say, you know, that's not something that I've necessarily covered. However, based on my own knowledge, what I might approach this as, or how I might approach that is, and, you know, essentially try and sort of work it out from there. But yeah, the key thing is to show that you are inquisitive and sort of eager to learn as well. So yeah, essentially the interviewers are looking for evidence that you are willing to engage with new ideas as well. The interview is a sort of dialogue, it's a conversation with the tutors. It's not just a sort of one-sided, somebody asks you a question and you respond in the best way you can. You are allowed to sort of bounce back and forth. And actually, if you can adapt in the moment to new ideas or new ways of thinking, then that's brilliant. You're allowed to change your mind as well. So if you say something, then you think, actually, no, I need to backtrack, or perhaps that doesn't quite fit with what you were trying to say, then again, just verbally show that and show how you're working that out in the moment. And yeah, they're not trying to make you feel ignorant or to catch you out, but they're only trying to sort of stretch your potential and to sort of see how far they can sort of push the thinking in the moment and what more they can get from you. And yeah, top tip is just try not to second guess what they want to hear, just be yourself in the moment, and that's what they're looking for. So yeah, this is a bit of a sort of a quote. So a medicine tutor has written, what if you make a mistake? Well, you could, for example, you said something that on reflection does not seem so clever at all, no big deal. Oh, sorry, I take that back. Perhaps this might be a better way to think about it. You're exploring a blind alley or two is part of the normal thought process, and everyone makes occasional mistakes, but only very good candidates spot their own mistakes and recover from them. So that is a testimonial to essentially say, if you spotted your mistake and you actually declare it in the moment, then that's brilliant as well. So yeah, you might be thinking again, am I going to be asked about my extracurricular activities? More detail that you've put on your personal statement, for example. You could be. Again, that might be just to put you at ease or to sort of, again, make it more of a kind of conversation as opposed to something where you're feeling a bit anxious. The focus of interviews is always academic, but again, it might come into play, and it's just there to help you, I guess, as well. But the focus will tend to be on the subject itself. So don't necessarily over prepare, thinking that you're going to talk about your extracurricular activities. Another kind of misconception perhaps is, do you have to ask a question at the end? You absolutely don't. You can if you want, but don't put pressure on yourself to feel like you have to. And that question at the end doesn't necessarily form, that's not part of the assessment of the interview. And we also ensure at both Oxford and Cambridge that there is provision for disabled students as well. So if you have any concerns about accessing the interviews or the interview content after you sort of heard briefly what it might be like, then you just need to make sure that you contact your college directly before your interview, just to ask for adjustments. So that might be in reference to the materials that you receive. It might be having extra time or just a different kind of accessible format. And again, both of that guidance you can find on the Oxford and Cambridge websites respectively.
Okay, so now you've heard about what the interview is like and what you can expect from it. We're going to move on just briefly to how you can prepare. So perhaps what interviewers are expecting from candidates before they get to the interview, and some ways that you can help mostly just reassure yourself that you've done some preparation and you're ready for what questions might be asked of you in the interview. So to start with, the most important thing is to be yourself. When you're preparing for an interview, don't try and kind of craft this personality of what you think the ideal Oxford or Cambridge student is like. There isn't one, as hopefully you'll see from our student ambassadors a little bit later on. Oxford and Cambridge students come from all different backgrounds, all different subject interests. And so who you are and what you're interested in academically is certainly enough. Another really important tip is to practice speaking about your subject and your thoughts about what you've seen or read. This is a really important one because in the interview, you're asked to verbally respond to questions in a way that you might not have done before. So you're probably quite used to writing down your answers in exams or solving problems by doing some scribbled working out. You're not that used to explaining your thought process and how you solve problems. So this is a different skill you can practice in preparation for the interview. Don't worry if you aren't able to have a formal mock interview. Some schools offer them, some schools don't. Sometimes you'll be part of other programs or organisations that can offer you a mock interview, but they're not the be all and end all. It can be quite helpful to get you used to speaking to an unfamiliar person about your subject. If you can't do that, don't worry at all. You can record yourself speaking and talking in the mirror or to someone else, talk to a parent or a friend or a sibling, anyone who will listen to you talk about your subject. And that will really help you get used to articulating your thoughts out loud rather than on paper. I'd also really recommend finding examples of your subject in the wider world. So this is applicable no matter which course you're applying for, but perhaps especially the arts and humanities and perhaps things like biology and psychology, where news stories are regularly in the media about these subjects, and there's definitely ways that you can engage with current affairs in a way that will expand your knowledge on the subject. So I'd recommend finding a couple of reputable sources that you find interesting, a few newspapers or websites or magazines that you enjoy the writing style of, and just having a look every now and then on what stories are in there that week or that month, making some notes on what's happening in the world in your subject at that time, because it might be useful to draw on in the interview. You might not be asked about any particular current affairs, but it still widens your knowledge, and it can help you bring in as an example for various different questions that you're asked. On the other hand, for the maths and science courses, your interviews are quite likely to be very problem-solving based. You're quite likely to dive straight into a problem-solving question without much small talk around that. And that's because you're testing the skills that are needed for that course, which is predominantly problem-solving. So practice solving problems that are more difficult than you're used to, because as we've said, the interviews are quite tricky and there's a high likelihood that you may get some of the questions wrong or be slightly off base. And that's fine, that's completely normal, but getting used to finding problems difficult, accessing problems that are more difficult than you're used to in school is a really good skill, because it helps you kind of take a step back, figure out some different approaches you can take, and get familiar with getting things wrong, which is a really useful skill to learn from as well. And thinking about how you can take different alleyways to find the answer to the problem, perhaps with some hints and tips from the interviewers. But the difficulty is a really key thing to practice, because the interview questions are designed to be challenging. If you are applying for a course that you don't currently study at school or college, you might be asked to discuss some kind of background research that you've done on it and really show that you're interested, kind of tell the interviewers why you've chosen to study this course when you have very little background in it. And so showing that you've perhaps done some reading or done some research to find out more about what the course and the subject involves, and you know what you're signing up for. On the other hand, if you are applying for a course that you already do at school or a very similar subject, we'd really recommend revising material that you have already studied recently. Especially for Cambridge, in the My Cambridge application form that you filled out, you have told the admissions tutors of that college which A-level topics you're currently studying, and that information is passed on to your interviewers so they know what to ask you, what topics you might want to talk about in the interview. And so I'd recommend doing a bit of revision on those sorts of topics and making sure you're confident talking about them in the interview. And as we've said already, remember to reread your personal statement. If this does come up, it's a really good opportunity for you to expand on topics you're really confident talking about. So make sure that this part of the interview, if it does come up, then goes really well. The same goes for any written work as well. It might be brought up in the interview, so it's worth being able to talk about it. You can also think about some of the kind of leading basic questions that might be asked at the beginning of your interview. This might be things from your personal statement or your written work, or kind of a big question about something in current affairs happening at that time. You can never predict the interview questions that may come up, but you can get an idea of what sorts of topics might be asked, and it's useful practice whether or not they do actually come up in the interview. Some quite broad advice, but quite useful, is taking a critical view of ideas and arguments that you encounter at school or college, or in your reading in the media. So whatever it is you're studying or reading about, thinking about all different sides of the debate is a really useful skill. Making sure that if you were asked that question, you could look at it from several different angles and see how people could view that question differently is a really useful skill for university students and for the interview. Some other questions that come up quite recently, so kind of preempting the Q&A section here. What about some coaching? We talked about mock interviews quite briefly. There's another quote here from an Oxford tutor in medicine, saying that most of the sorts of thinking questions we are asking are very difficult to rehearse for. So interviewers don't usually like very overly rehearsed answers. And it's quite easy for interviewers to tell when a candidate has kind of over-rehearsed in that way. So while you can prepare, try not to practice or rehearse set answers that you want to bring up in the interview, so it comes across quite artificial and not very you. The other point here is what you should wear. We'd always recommend you wear clothes that you're really comfortable in. It really doesn't matter what you wear. You are not being judged on your outfit choices. If you're having an online interview, you will only see your head and shoulders. And if you're in person, just be comfortable. It's not a fashion show. It's not a contest on what you're wearing. You're being assessed on your academic ability and potential, not your clothes. So again, hopefully reassuring. We've got a couple of sample questions here. So these are from a few different subjects to give you an idea of some of the kind of the big questions that will elicit quite a lot of different answers from applicants. So these are quite interesting to interviewers because the conversation could go in a lot of different directions after they pose you this question. All applicants will bring in different examples from what they've studied at school or for their own research, but it brings an interesting conversation that can potentially spread onto different questions, and the interview can flow quite nicely from just one starting question. So just taking one example, the first question here is, if I were to visit the area where you live, what would I be interested in? And so you could take this any way you want, depending on the course you're applying for and for your own interests in that course. So if we're thinking about if it was a geography question, which I believe this example is, thinking about any kind of physical or natural landmarks that might be of interest, any kind of local history you're aware of, anything unique about the area, perhaps any street names or buildings or famous people or events. And the interviewers may then ask something else. And so it's a starting point. The questions are very rarely kind of used in isolation. They quite often flow onto a different question that's related, and it becomes a conversation rather than a kind of question and answer. So try and think about that even if you do get faced with a slightly, what seems like a bizarre question or a difficult one to answer, think about how your answer could take the conversation somewhere different. And that might be really interesting to both you and the interviewers. There are lots more sample questions, as we said, on the Oxford website, which are also applicable to Cambridge. So I'd recommend having a look at those and using them to practice with if you want to. And then just finally, before we get on to the Q&A section, if you're looking for more support and advice with interviews, there are some places you can go. So on the left-hand side here, we have the Oxford website, which has a helpful timeline of which stage of the application process you're at, and some further information in written form about the interview process. So if you just search up Oxford interviews, this will come up. On the right-hand side is the Cambridge equivalent. As you can see, very similar. It has some kind of question and answers on some information about interviews and some other helpful links to related web pages if you want them. And the final thing we'd recommend is a website called Inside Uni. I used to work on this when I was a student, and I found it really helpful when I was applying to Cambridge as well. And so this is a group of Oxford and Cambridge students who collect interview testimonies from current Oxford and Cambridge students who have done their interviews in the last few years, and they publish them on this website. There are thousands on there, and you can filter it by your course and your college and your university to see what previous candidates talked about in their interviews. They don't give away the questions, of course, but it gives you an idea of what the atmosphere was like, what sort of topics they were asked about, whether they talked about written work or a graph or a personal statement, those sorts of general things. And it also, again, provides some reassurance that people can and do enjoy the interview process and find it useful. This is another resource you can access if you want to. The website's on the screen, and it is a useful resource to get an insight into lots of different students and how their interview experiences were. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. So we're going to move on to the Q&A section now. So I will firstly ask our student ambassadors to introduce themselves. While they're doing that, if you want to pop any questions you've got in the chat, and that will allow us to see all the questions that you've got, and we'll go through them as many as we can. So I can see everyone's turning their cameras on, which is brilliant. If I start with my Cambridge group, and I'll hand over to Josephine to introduce the Oxford ambassadors. So we'll start off with Jacob.
Hi, I'm Jacob, second year medic here at Magdalene in Cambridge.
Thank you. And Georgie.
Hi, I'm Georgie. I'm a first year education student at Magdalene, Cambridge.
And Dev.
Hi, I'm Dev. I'm a first year modern languages student, specifically Spanish and Portuguese at Magdalene as well.
And finally, Dora.
Hello, I'm Dora. I'm the first year modern student studying chemical engineering and biotechnology.
Thank you very much.
And then we've got two ambassadors here from Oxford. So we'll start with Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah. I'm a second year biology student at St Peters.
And then we've also got Rory.
Hi, I'm Rory. I'm a fourth year maths student at St Peters.
Thank you very much. Okay, if you'd like to put any questions that you've got in the chat, if you want to ask a particular student, you can see their subjects and their names for a lot of them, or if you want to ask any of us, then please feel free to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone to address questions to. Please pop your questions in the chat and we'll start answering them. The first question I can see is asking for a link to the Oxford interview questions. Yeah, I'll pop that in the chat now for you.
I've just done that, Natalie, sorry.
Fab, thank you. Beat me to it.
That's all right. We've got a couple of questions coming in, but we'll just wait a minute to let them all arrive.
A quick one is how long does an interview last? So for Cambridge, interviews tend to be about 25 minutes if you have two of them. For some small subjects, so things like archaeology sometimes only has one interview, and in that case it's 45 minutes, so you get about the same amount of time whether you have one interview or two interviews. Is that about the same for Oxford?
Yeah, it's about the same. Again, it varies depending on the different subject. And in terms of the interview content time, it might be around sort of half an hour, but you will be given then time beforehand to read over and or have time to work out the problem that you're given as well. So it does depend. I think also I wouldn't judge the interview on how long it runs for. Sometimes some tutors run over, sometimes they're very strict on the timing, and that again just really depends on the tutors that are sort of taking the interview. It's not a reflection on your performance necessarily as well.
A really good question for our student ambassadors. How did you deal with nerves in the lead up to and during your interview? Would anyone like to take that one?
Yeah, go on, I'll start with this one. One really kind of bizarre piece of advice that I got from my EPQ supervisor back in the day was to kind of approach the interview with the mindset of like not stressing about it, because kind of whatever will be, and you know, that's that kind of thing. It was kind of to like almost put yourself in the mindset of I don't care, but obviously you do care. So it's kind of like it's quite a contrasting thing, but basically the point of what you said was it's like don't overthink about it in like the days leading up to it. Don't hype it up as some massive event in your own head. It's just another thing on your to-do list for that day that you've got to go and have like a quick Zoom chat with some people from a university. So yeah, I think that's probably the main thing. Like don't overthink it in your own head, because then you just stress stuff out and there's no need for that.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So I would say for my interview, I tried to do all my preparation kind of straight away when I got the offer. So then the evening before my interview was it was 2 like consecutive days. So the evening before it started, I just did not do anything, did not look at any of my notes, just tried to have the most relaxing evening that I could, because naturally you're going to be really stressed out about it. I know that I was. But yeah, I just say relax, don't cram the night before your interview, because if it's not in your head already, it's not going to help stressing yourself out cramming when you could just relax.
Yeah, definitely. The second that don't do any studying just before. So mine was a bit different because I'm very old, so mine was in person. But I was here for 4 days in the end, and I just spent all the time playing table tennis in the common room and doing no maths, and it was great. I just kind of thought of it as a holiday, just thought of it, think of it as, I wasn't really expecting to come here, wasn't really expecting to get an interview at all, go in with no expectations and just see how it goes, basically.
Yeah, and try and have fun with it as well. I think, you know, just echoing what the ambassador's saying is yeah, try not to second guess anything, relax, and just try and have as much fun as you can.
Yeah, exactly. The next question I can see is quite specific. I've applied to Pembroke College, meaning my interview was in person, and you were asked for your nearest city on the Cambridge application form. That is because of online interviews, not because of in-person ones. So your in-person interview will be held in Cambridge. The applicants are asked about their nearest city for online interviews in case we need to accommodate for time zones, things like that. So if it's an in-person interview, it will be in Cambridge. And another question perhaps for the student ambassadors, did you find that you showed your working out in the online interview, and how do you show the interview you're working out? So perhaps Dora or Jacob, do you show any working out during your interview?
Yeah.
Oh, go on, Dora.
Oh, thank you. So I think I show my work out by using another device. Like I use my iPad to write it on the shared board. So they will also see like the calculation you made for a specific questions, and also like those graph sketching questions, maybe for those science subject, you are also going to give all the details in the shared whiteboard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, obviously for medicine, we didn't have like a keypad to kind of write on and whatnot. So it is a case of literally when you're showing you're working out, you're doing it verbally. So kind of like materializing all your thoughts and kind of like evaluating them as you're going along. So say if, if they ask a question, but, you've kind of got like 2 or 3 different kind of potential lines of inquiry to go down with your answer, kind of like evaluate each one of those as you kind of, explain them, because then it kind of shows that you can take the weak points in your argument as well as you're going through, but also in terms of like highlighting potential points that you might not know because you've not covered it. So you might be kind of like, oh, but I need some more information on this to be able to kind of proceed forward, to be able to answer the next kind of stage. That's also really useful to do.
Can I just add to that as well? So from Oxford's perspective, I can't speak to Cambridge, but I'm sure they do something similar. If for whatever reason you don't have technology to sort of show your working out, so what happens with the online interview is if you have to show working out through the interview process, you'll get notified in what kind of way that you show that. So there's a program that Oxford use called Miro, which sort of allows you to show your workings out as you're sort of online. But if for whatever reason you don't have access to like a tablet or something that you can do that on, then that's not a problem. You just need to let your college know, or for whatever reason, if the connection kind of stalls in the process of doing that, the tutors can adapt to then show your workings out by using like a good old-fashioned like flip chart, or you can literally write it on a piece of paper and hold it to the camera. So don't panic if you're a bit kind of worried about the technology side of things, and just, yeah, like I said, get in touch with your college directly if that is something that you're worried about.
Yeah, once again, we're not judging you on your technology capabilities, we're judging on your academic and potential. So don't worry about that at all. Another question here is how much knowledge of your subject is expected at the interview? That's a really good question. Perhaps go to one ambassador who's studying like a new subject for the degree. So for instance, Georgie, do you want to talk about how much knowledge you had of education before you started?
Yeah, of course. So I had a fair amount of school experience, not just obviously going to school, but also volunteering in schools. I did a lot of meetings with head teachers and other educational people. So I'd say, yeah, doing that and having that sort of experience is very helpful. And being able to go out and do those sorts of things, but also incorporating the reading as well that you've done, that's very helpful. But yeah, getting that experience of doing things that is relevant to your subject. But yeah, bringing in the knowledge from doing other things like going and having meetings and going and talking to people, I think really helps.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that one?
I can. I had a Portuguese interview and I'd never studied Portuguese before. So I had done really, really basic grammar things. And I was told at the start of the interview that they didn't expect me to know anything as well. So if you have got something like that, there isn't a huge expectation, especially in languages, to know that much.
Fab.
I think
we
maybe
sorry.
it's okay. For these questions, for the STEAM subject, the basic things you need to know is more about revisions about A-level things. Like it's not only about 1 year, but including the AS level and the A2 level. Maybe I do more extension about because all the syllabus is all fixed in A-level. It just differs from the like hardness and difficulties of the questions it gave you. Maybe you have to think in a various aspect, and the questions is just going to be more complicated than A level. So maybe some practice for the questions is still review the knowledge you learn from A level, but try to do other exercises such as the website published on the Isaac physics and more like Olympic questions. They can help you.
Yeah, some really good resources there that we'd always recommend. Things like Isaac Physics, if you're applying for maths or physics or engineering, is really, really useful for practicing those hard problems on questions that we were talking about. It really stretches you beyond what you're doing at school, which is exactly what we're looking for. Yeah, thank you for that, really good advice. Couple more questions I've seen. We have a question about written work for modern languages. We're not really going to cover written work in this webinar, going to focus on interviews, but with a deadline for written work coming up super soon, I'd really recommend emailing the college you applied to if you're not sure. It's really important to get that right. So please do email the college as soon as you can. We also have a person who's on a gap year applying for economics. Interview students could be tested on topics they had covered so far at A-level. Does that mean you could be tested on anything on the economics A-level syllabus or only what was covered in year 12? I would say, I think Josephine probably agree, revise what you've studied throughout the syllabus, especially if you've taken some time out. Make sure that you're kind of revising things quite regularly and being on top of what you have studied. And the questions could cover anything on that syllabus, I would expect as well. If the written work is from subjects that aren't really relevant to the chosen course, will they question you on it? Less likely, I would say. The written work is often for subjects that are quite broadly classed as arts and humanities, but might not have applicable A-level subjects. And so if you have written something that is relevant to your course, it is both used as an indication of your writing style, but also a topic of discussion at the interview. If it's not relevant to your chosen course, it may be that it doesn't really come up in your interview, but it's still used in the background as an indication of your writing style. So I hope that provides some clarification there. We have a question on medicine. I'll hand over to Jacob, if that's okay. For medicine, will the questions be mainly scientific, or will there still be some ethical questions and questions about work experience and volunteering?
Yeah, so for me, I think the majority of them were scientific questions, but I did obviously get asked like an ethics question, and then also like a question relating to what I'd put on my personal statement, which was to do with work experience as well. So both will happen, but I'd probably say most of the interview will be more the scientific line of questioning, because obviously of how different the course is at Cambridge, with it being, that clear distinction of pre-clin and clin years.
Thank you. We have a question about psychological and behavioural sciences. Does PBS count as a scientific subject? If so, what sorts of problems might be shown at the interview? Josephine, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously I don't study this subject exactly, but I think of all the student ambassadors, my biology is probably the closest, because yes, I do a scientific subject, but the subject's essay-based, like I don't have problem sheets or anything. Me personally, I didn't have to do any problems during the interview or anything. It was all very verbal and kind of working through. Obviously, mine was more animal behaviour than human behaviour, which I assume psychology would be. But if it's anything like the biology interviews at Oxford, I don't think you would get asked any problems. It would just any like problems like you would in maths, for example. It just kind of be talking through situations instead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're unlikely to get like a kind of actual scientific like equation to have to decode. It's going to be more to do with kind of questions surrounding like the behavioural aspect. I think that would be something to focus on. And you know, again, remember that you won't necessarily have studied that at A level in the same way that you will do as a degree course. So it's how you would then sort of approach the questions using your knowledge with presumably what you have, which is probably psychology A level, in addition to your other subjects as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think I've reached the end of the questions for now. While we're waiting for any more to come in, our student ambassadors, would you like to give your kind of one piece of advice? If you could advise our students watching today one thing in preparation for their interviews, what do you think it would be? Anyone wants to go first? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, just talk out loud. Don't sit there in silence. Whatever you're thinking, just say it. Doesn't matter how stupid you think it is, because they want to see you. They want to see what you're thinking about and how you're thinking about it. They don't want the right answer straight away. So if you're just saying some garbage, just say it and then find out why it's garbage. It's much better than just sitting there looking like you've got no idea what's going on.
Mine would be to make sure that you're very clued up on your personal statement. Obviously, we spoke through this earlier. I was a bit of an odd case. My interview was majority on my personal statement, which I don't know if that was a Peters specific thing or a biology specific thing, but even other biologists at St. Peters have said this isn't what happened for them. But there is an off chance, I am the anomaly, that it was mainly on my personal statement. So just in case, just make sure that everything you write about in your personal statement, you know how to talk about, because if you write about it, then they expect that you know what you're talking about.
Just to give a contrasting opinion on that, I just could let you know that I wasn't asked at all about my personal statement. They didn't even, this is for maths. I don't know if that's universal, but they didn't say anything. So.
Thanks, guys. And I think that just shows then that every interview is going to be individual, so you can take comfort from that, in that you can prep with what you've written and you know everything that you can do, but in the moment it's sort of how you respond, and that's kind of what you get assessed on, if you like. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I'll go next. Yeah, I'd say first of all, don't stress, don't overthink like the night before. Make sure you get like a good rest the night before. Make sure you have like a decent breakfast on the day. Then like second piece of advice in terms of like actually in the interview, don't be afraid to ask questions, because it is meant to be a two-way discussion between you and the people on Zoom. So yeah, don't ever shy away from that.
I would say maybe think before you talk, because for our subjects, you have to first give out your master before you like do the details. So to summarize your masters in a more logical way, because the more important thing is on the ideas you show rather than the answer you give. So just give the details and just like building a mind map and give them the summary for how you think for the question.
I think just be confident in what you know, because ultimately you've been given the interview, so they think that you have really good potential. So just go for it and be confident, and don't feel like what you're saying is wrong in any way. Just talk exactly about what you think and what you know, and don't be afraid to to just say it, because if you think it might be wrong, it's better that it's said.
I would say that if you're confused or unsure about an answer, to not panic and stay calm. Try to think about whatever information you have that can be relevant to the question, and know that you're not expected to know the answer to everything. It's meant to be a two-way conversation, so you can always ask questions or take time.
Really good advice. Thank you so much. We've had a couple more questions coming in. First one is, are interviews the most important part of the application process, or are all parts assessed equally? So I'll quickly go through this from a Cambridge perspective, and then perhaps Josephine, if you want to add anything for Oxford. So interviews are definitely not the kind of be all and end all or the final hurdle as some students see them as. They are definitely an important part of the process. As you said at the start, it's a way to kind of get to know the candidates better and to learn more about them as a whole person, rather than just a name on a page or a spreadsheet. So they definitely are important, but they are not the only factor that's considered. We also look at your personal statement, we look at your admissions assessments, any written work, anything else you've sent us as part of your application. It is all looked at several times by several people, and taken into consideration. I won't say that all parts are equally important, because as you might be able to understand, something like the admissions assessment is quite important for like maths and science subjects, where we're getting a good indication of what your problem solving skills are like, whereas a personal statement for those subjects is perhaps less important because it's your writing style and things that are less relevant for the skills needed for the degree. So it does depend on the course you're applying for, and the university as well. But all things are taken into account, and the interview is not the only thing. Josephine, would you agree for an Oxford point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's treated exactly the same as sort of what you said from a Cambridge perspective. I think I would consider the interview as you are showcasing your thought process and your thinking in person. So that's something that can't be gleaned necessarily from written work or your personal statement. So an interview is just sort of one aspect of trying to understand who you are as an applicant, and it's something that forms a bigger picture. It's not the only thing, nor is it weighted any heavily or more than, say, the admissions test, written work altogether. So yeah, it's all about creating a kind of holistic profile of you as an applicant, and the interview does one aspect of that.
Fab. And the last question we've got for now is, if a personal statement is for a subject not very relevant to the subject I applied for, because the subject's only offered at Cambridge, could I still be questioned on it? Did any of our ambassadors apply for a course that's only really offered at Cambridge, or applied for slightly different courses at different universities? Yeah, Dora?
Maybe it's a different in Cambridge, but just like little difference, because for Cambridge, this is a new course called Chemical Engineering Biotechnology. But for the rest of my choice for the school, I applied for chemical engineering. It means that I haven't covered any about my biotechnology things in my personal statement, and I haven't encountered any A-level biology subject before, but I still got some tested on the biology, maybe the potential for studying biotechnology in the interview. So it may be quite related for the specific course in Cambridge, I think.
Thank you. So yeah, so if your personal statement is applying to lots of different universities and different courses, that's completely normal, and we understand that. It may be that your personal statement isn't brought up as much as a result, but they may still pick on just kind of one or two things to ask you more about if they're interested in it. But don't worry about it, because so many applicants are applying to different courses at different universities, and we're very, very used to that. So don't worry at all. Okay, I've reached the end of the questions at the moment, so if anyone's got any final questions, please pop them in the chat now, otherwise we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. We have a modern languages question for Dev, so I'll pick on you. If you're applying for modern languages, do you have to talk in the languages of the course that you're applying for during your interview?
If you've studied it at A level, you will have. I personally had to talk for about half of my interview in Spanish, and then the other half was in English. And for my Portuguese one, there was obviously no speaking in Portuguese because I'd never studied it.
Good answer. Very concise and to the point, exactly right. So if you are applying for a post A-level language, then we expect a level of speaking proficiency, but not to worry about your new languages because you're learning from scratch at university, so don't expect any background knowledge there. Okay, I think that is it. So we'll wrap up here. So thank you so much to all of our student ambassadors for joining us from Oxford and Cambridge. We really appreciate your advice and your insights into the interview process. Thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully you found this a useful introduction to what the interviews are like, and some signposting to other resources you can have a look at. So make sure to have a look at the sample questions if you're interested. If the links about disabled applicants are applicable to you, have a look at whether your interview will be in person or online, and if you're eligible for any travel reimbursement if it is in person. So some food for thought, hopefully, and things to look at. But more than anything, best of luck for the rest of your application process. We hope you all receive an invitation to interview, and hopefully you've got some good advice on how to prepare for it. So thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you, guys.